good day to you. Distinguished guests and travelers, it's a pleasure to see you here in Akureyri. I'm sure you've had a very enjoyable journey so far, and I hope you'll enjoy it even more on your way back. It's an interesting route you're going to be taking. Thank you, Eir, for your presentation. Luckily, I decided not to emphasize the economic side of shipping, otherwise I would have been completely redundant by now. But it's good to see you again. I'm trying out this new presentation program, so bear with me if I completely blow it. I have a backup on PowerPoint, so you'll definitely be able to receive all the information that I pretend that I have to give. I'm not really going to talk solely about Arctic shipping. I'm going to mention, of course, Arctic shipping, but I will also mention oil, and I will also mention the context of Iceland, and I will say a couple of words about risk in the end. The reason I want to talk about oil is because you can't talk about Arctic and new economic activity in the Arctic without mentioning oil, at least once. So what we are experiencing these days in the Arctic is change. And this is something that's going to affect us, but we're going to have to change along with the changes. We're going to have to adapt to these changes. We already know that there are significant indications that Earth's climate system are changing. Glaciers are melting all over the place, and sea ice is both retreating and thinning at a greater pace than predicted. Latest news indicate a rate of loss 50% higher than previously predicted, and this is based on some sort of compiled data from NASA and ESA. Primary impacts will result in increased pressures on various systems, including natural, physical, ecological, life-sustaining, as well as social systems. And this will, of course, have implications for all host of factors: resource scarcity, infrastructures, movement of peoples, political stability or instability, and conflicts and inequality. And now I'm not just talking about the Arctic, I'm talking about globally. Mitigation and adaptive capacity will be a key issue at international, national and local levels. Secondary impacts, what I call secondary impacts, is human activity made possible by climatic and physical changes. And now I will turn to the Arctic, which is changing at a faster rate than we're keeping up with. There's a whole host of social, environmental and economic implications in the Arctic region. There could be positive impacts and there could also be negative impacts. There are opportunities, like we have heard almost every speaker talk about today. There's also potential risks, hazards and disasters. And I don't think we should forget to talk about them in all the talk about opportunities, because risk is always going to be a part of an opportunity. It's imperative, these impacts will have differential and contradictory effects. And this is going to depend on geography, vulnerability levels, adaptive capacity and resilience levels, both in terms of ecological and social systems. And this is doubly true in the Arctic. It is imperative for us to find a way to keep up with these changes and to observe and explore how these changes are taking place and how they interact. How are social and ecological systems impacted, and what are the implications for resilience of communities and the region as a whole? This is going to be a process that will have to include the reconciliation between sometimes seemingly conflicting uses of resources, such as fisheries and transport of oil, etc. It is also a process which will have to include a balanced dialogue between multiple stakeholders, including communities and peoples, regarding both benefits, risks, and negative impacts on new activities. Now to the oil. This is from the AMSA report, I think, Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. And I have to say that if you really, really want to have a good overview of Arctic shipping, then the Arctic Marine Strategic Assessment, Shipping Assessment, that was published by the Protection of Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, is a very, very good place to start. So I would recommend you read that report from cover to cover if you're really interested. The world uses approximately 86 billion barrels of oil. That is about 40,000 gallons every second. We are completely addicted to this. World population is expected to exceed 9 billion by the year 2050. There's an increase of 50%, which is expected in demand of energy. Oil accounted for some 33% of total world energy consumption, which is actually that it is going down, while coal and nuclear energy is going up, whereas alternative energy such as wind and solar power is only about 2.2% of global energy consumption. It is, however, on the rise, and I think it went up some 25% in the last 10 years. Only when percentage is low, it's going to be a very low increase. There are many who claim that we have already reached peak oil or are very close to reaching peak oil. I think it is Matt Simmons who claims that 58 countries are already producing less than they did in the past, which means that they have hit the curve. They've hit the top of the curve and on a slippery slope downwards. The Arctic is rich in non-renewable resources, and there is great potential for extraction of oil and gas and other minerals. According to the US Geological Survey, oil and gas could potentially include 90 billion barrels of oil, 1,669 cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. Now, these numbers don't really tell me anything at all, but it sounds like a lot, certainly. And I think that this only includes what is believed to be extractable oil. So potentially there's more. I don't know, I'm not a geologist, but it sounds like there's certain uncertainties involved. Activity is already taking place in many places. Oil companies, both state-owned oil companies and private corporations, are applying for leases for exploratory drilling. Shell is waiting on the edge of its seat for permission to start exploratory drilling, and I think they're quite close to it. Gazprom is drilling in the Yamal field, and we have ExxonMobil, British Petroleum, Rosneft, and other companies, Statoil, who are already preparing. In terms of Arctic shipping, there might be a few repetitions from Eir, and I believe Thorstein talked a little bit about Arctic shipping as well. There is already increased access for transport through Arctic waters. We could be seeing more cruise ships, general cargo containers, ships, bulk cargo and oil and gas, although it is likely that, at least in the beginning, bulk cargo and transport related to resource extraction will be what we are seeing in the beginning. You've already seen the three routes that we are talking about, which is really convenient because you can't actually see it on my slide. Sorry about that. What I want to say is that generally people seem to believe that the trans-Arctic route is not viable for a long time. I am starting to wonder if that perhaps is not the case. I mean, if every update of ice recession and thinning is somehow exponentially bigger than the one before, then I claim that we don't actually know if this is going to happen in the next 10 years, 20 or 50. And I think there is great possibility that it will happen sooner than we think. I'm not saying that we should rush in and start building lots of buildings in expectation and anticipation, but we should definitely watch out for what's going on. So we have the Northwest Passage between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. We have the Trans-Arctic and the Northeast, and as I think Eir already told you, there were 11 vessels used in 2010, 34 in 2011, of up to 820,000 tons of cargo which passed through the local sea route. There were lots of tourists in the region, including some cruise ships, which is actually a bit of a cause of concern in terms of safety of passengers and crew, of course. The northern sea route could mean 60% in savings in shipping. I will not go further into that because Eir has already discussed this. It is technically possible, but there have of course been questions of economic feasibility, including the study that I referred to before. Polar class ships are very expensive to produce. Container vessels could be up to 20,000 EU. Maybe in the end, though, in 30 years, it's going to be a completely ice-free summer in the Arctic. We're not going to need these polar class ships. I don't know. The Lloyd report, as also previously referred to, predicts an investment of up to $100 billion in the region in the next decade or so. But it also warns against moving too quickly. And Lloyd's is one of the biggest insurance companies in the world. And it's a very, very big insurer in the shipping industry. And it claims that the region is not ready for this activity as of yet. So I believe that perhaps if an insurance company tells you that there are too many risks to start rushing in, we should probably listen to it. Estimated volumes of tanker-related maritime traffic on the northern northern sea route, and this is also according to the AMSA report, is expected to be approximately 40 million tons of gas and oil by 2020. Generally, when you are scoping texts on this subject, probabilities of major accidents are considered to be low. But it is usually recognized that the consequences of such an accident could be disastrous in this region. There are, of course, opportunities and potential benefits, and Iceland, of course, is considering those, and in some corners they have been considering it for quite a while now. There is the potential of the oil coming from Russia, the Dreki area, possibly, and East Greenland. There have been ideas of transshipment ports and other related infrastructure, service ports for exploration ships, oil exploration ships, service hubs and harbor for oil tankers, storage facilities, refineries, and security and rescue centers. Actually, I have to say that security and rescue centers is my favorite. I think that's a really good idea. But, stakes are high in environmental, social, and economic terms, both for Iceland and for everyone else involved in the region. It could mean diversification of economic activity. And for certain regions in Iceland, that is not nothing. There are possibly national, regional, local economic benefits. We understand that shipping and the construction of related infrastructure could, in fact, bring lots of opportunity and benefits. We understand that. Employment opportunities could be more easily available for local communities, marginal local communities in Iceland. There could be new business opportunities for local communities and change in population dynamics with an increase which could lead to improvements in infrastructure. But there are also concerns. Benefits, and this is not just the Arctic, this is in general in projects, in mega projects. Benefits in terms of employment, business, services, or economic, they tend to leak out of the local economy. So this is something that we have to watch for. If we decide to engage in activities such as this, whether it has to do with oil or shipping or both, we should absolutely be very clear on what it is that we want and make sure that the local community and region benefits. Rapid changes can challenge a community's adaptive capacity. We know this. Just by reading the literature on Arctic peoples, we know that rapid changes can have serious effects on adaptive capacity. Not to forget, though, that humans do have an amazing capacity for adaptation. New economic activity can be in conflict and will have to be reconciled with local, existing, and traditional economic activity. In terms of Iceland, we are mostly talking about fisheries, but we could also be talking about tourists, and especially if we're talking about some sort of accidents which would involve spillage. The Arctic ecosystem is particularly fragile and vulnerable to environmental hazards, and impacts of shipping alone, which is actually what I think concerns the researchers with the protection of Arctic marine environment, are most concerned about is regular impact from regular shipping. and it includes discharges to water, ship emissions, which is soot, which also has implications for the melting of ice. Sound and noise disturbance, introduction of invasive species, ballast water, hull fouling, and casualties in general. Oil spills, where they do occur, can have grave consequences for marine and coastal ecosystems as well as socio-economic systems. In the end, it's a question of resilience for ecological and social systems and the region as a whole. I do believe that the Arctic Council, or some sort of working group related to the Arctic Council, is now working on issues of resilience and trying to assess and support policymaking in terms of resilience of the Arctic. We should not forget that accidents do happen, and errors are made, as we saw in Exxon Valdez in 1989, Prestige in 2002, I think, and Deepwater Horizon just almost yesterday. In terms of governance of Arctic shipping, there are quite a few frameworks that do apply in various ways. Some of them are very specific. For instance, the one that has to do with the polar bear. Law of the Sea is the major framework. It applies to the Arctic region, but without specific context-based requirements, and it's binding only on those states parties to the convention. The US still hasn't ratified the agreement. The Polar Code, which I believe was supposed to be finished by now, but it's not because there are certain challenges. It's under review from its previous non-binding version. Includes sections on design, equipment and systems, operation, certification and environmental protection. But there are certain challenges that they have faced. There's the lack of charts and information systems, the different perspectives concerning levels of risks, the extent to which additional requirements are needed, and even on whether additional measures for environmental protection should in fact be included. There is a newly signed search and rescue agreement on cooperation in aeronautical and maritime search and rescue in the Arctic, which was signed at the Arctic Council Ministerial meeting in Nuuk in May of 2011. This is a very good step. There's also work being conducted in the oil spill task force within the auspices of the Arctic Council again to develop an international instrument on Arctic marine oil pollution preparedness and response. I think the intention is for this agreement to be binding. And the Russian just passed a law, apparently, on the Northern Seaboard, which is a very good thing. And it covers ship owner responsibility, where they're trying to actually put more responsibility on the ship owners. Service fees, of course, they want to be paid for their services along the route, and environmental protection. The liability and compensation regime, as far as I've been able to tell, but obviously I'm not a legal expert, is both fragmented and largely self-regulatory. And there seems to be an extremely problematic and lengthy process for communities or individuals who have suffered technical and environmental crisis. So this is definitely an area that needs to be further researched and dealt with to some extent. Or not to some extent, it just needs to be dealt with somehow. We have both the cases of Xuelong in Ecuador and also Exxon Valdez, where still 20 years later, cases are ongoing where people are trying to get compensation. Complicating those issues, of course, is the political nature of these cases. But enough of that. It's a very quick overview of governance of the Arctic. Cleanup and rescue capacity lacking. There are a few Arctic-based resources to address oil spills and distinct lack of necessary infrastructure. The remoteness and general conditions in the Arctic are harsh and unpredictable. Receding ice and thinning ice does not equal predictable and safe conditions. Weather and location of ice is unpredictable, will even be more unpredictable, so even more caution might be needed. The appropriate technology and knowledge is lacking for ice-covered waters. Systems for monitoring and controlling the movement of ships are few, although I just read the other day about a Japanese microsatellite that could potentially be used to monitor ice around Alaska. I'm not very savvy in satellite technology, but that was my understanding. The information networks for physical conditions such as wind, weather, wind, ice, waves, and maps is sparse. And in general, hazard management systems are lacking. Physical, ideological, psychological, economic rehabilitation, and community rehabilitation. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done because this, before this becomes a reality. And I think what we all hope is that people do not move too fast and make sure that the region is ready. We need to ensure that necessary expertise exists in terms of knowledge, institutions, processes, resources, financial, physical, and human. Bottom line, and this is still not the last slide, there is no comprehensive legal regime or treaty for activity in Arctic waters. There are those who believe that one should exist, not necessarily like the one in Antarctica, but one that would be comprehensive and somehow include all the relevant aspects. Whether or not this is feasible is another topic altogether, really. Because first of all, the Arctic nations, I think, have all claimed that the current legal framework is sufficient, and it just has to be implemented more strongly. But it may also be that the time-consuming nature of binding comprehensive legal agreement for the Arctic would just take too much time for it to be possible to finish before these activities become more concrete. So the legal framework is fragmented and insufficient in addressing complications to do with environmental protection and issues of safety. There is also a contradiction, which people generally don't seem to be interested in talking about too much, because if you read a comparison on Arctic nations' strategies, they all have a stated goal of sustainable development, that they all are very, very keen on exploiting the resources in the Arctic and using the shipping lanes, understandably up to a point. But there is a contradiction in these two pathways, which I think will be a challenge to figure out how to make that work out. The biggest worry, of course, is that national strategic interests seem to prevail. The major challenges, and this is still not the last slide, is international and national regulatory frameworks, infrastructural and navigational systems with rescue and cleanup capacity. And when I say this, I'm not saying that nothing is being done. I do believe that things are being done. I'm just wondering if enough is being done or if it's being done fast enough. Cleanup costs, compensation, and in general clarification of responsibility in specific projects. One of the problems in these legal cases after spillages is the fuzzy nature of assigned responsibility. And that is something that Iceland, for instance, should be very clear on. Who is supposed to do what and who is supposed to pay for what. We need baseline information. Another problem in the Exxon Valdez was they did not have any baseline information about the ecosystem and the environment. And you need baseline information to monitor pollution from activity, otherwise it's very difficult to monitor the pollution. If you don't know what the status is, then you can't say what has changed. It is important to explore resilience and impacts at local, regional and national levels, and include context-based risk analysis included in project impact assessment. Not use these models, but go and actually look at the communities that are close to projects like this and make an impact assessment based on that. Clarification of objectives and pathways. Now this is basically for us here in Iceland to do. It is to consider carefully what is appropriate development for not just the Icelandic economy, but the Icelandic communities. I have already talked about this point. And the final one is stringent risk assessment, mitigation and management. One might think that this is something that you wouldn't need to mention, but it appears that not everyone thinks that this is important. I also think that it will be challenging for all of these nations and stakeholders to agree on what the risks really are and to what extent we need to mitigate these risks and how we're going to deal with them. Because the perception of risk is a very complex phenomenon. It can vary between cultures. These are just a few of the factors that you might want to consider. It can vary between cultures and individuals. It is influenced by our value system, political biases, motivations, desire for a certain way of life and personal experiences, even greed. And the way we address a problem is directly connected to the way in which we perceive risk. And why is this important? A common failure of risk assessment is overconfidence and underestimation of risk factors. And people tend to somehow believe, or just decide to believe, that if there's a low likelihood of something, that somehow automatically equals no risk. And we decide that if there's a low likelihood of something, it doesn't merit a second thought. I don't believe that's true. Disasters are not isolated events. They're not merely accidents. They are the result of a multidimensional process and exist as complex and material events. And I'm not quoting Anthony Oliver Smith in the book Catastrophe and Culture. And at the same time as a multiplicity of interwoven, often conflicting social constructions. Disasters come into existence in both the material and social worlds, and perhaps in some hybrid space between them. Including the discourses that go on in institution processes, discourses, social constructions of risk, perception of risk, and even social construction of the perception of risk. I know, it's a bit of a stretch. A society's pattern of vulnerability is a core element of disaster. And now I'm almost finished. This is just me, because I always have to draw something. People-minded, I have to draw things so that I can understand them better. The way I see it, the perception of risk influences the way we assess, mitigate, and manage risk. It also influences the infrastructural and institutional robustness. You can't actually see this, can you? I can see puzzled looks. You can't see this. Okay, the box up there says perception of risk. And then there are just some, subtitles there that don't really matter because I'm not going to say much more on this. Then there's risk, and the one on there is institutional robustness, which is a really good word, and normative frameworks, which directly influence the level of resilience, which directly influences outcomes. Can you hear me? Which can distinguish between an easily managed situation, critical stages, or a full-blown disaster. So if we decide to openly talk about, assess, mitigate risk, we will strengthen our institutions to mitigate the risk, which will influence the level of resilience and our ability to adapt to changes, whether they are slow or rapid or in the form of a disaster. It's a wicked problem, and I really love this term, wicked problem. I first heard it when Mandy Kampf came to the ICAS conference a couple of years ago. She was actually talking about offshore oil drilling, I think, oil extraction. And she talked about the term wicked problem. I don't actually know very much about it. I just find it interesting, and I thought you might find it too, because I've been sort of bashing people over the head with negative things. I thought this would be a good end. And this is basically a description that I stole off Wikipedia, so I'm sorry about that. But I thought, it's just. But it's a phrase that is originally used in social planning to describe a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. It's not used in a sense of evil, but rather its resistance to resolution. Moreover, because of complex interdependency, the effort to solve one aspect of a wicked problem may reveal or create other problems. And I find this quite nicely descriptive of the Arctic situation. Thank you.